Welcome in this video of the House of Asian Cinema. Martial arts are among the cultural icons of China and have been widely used by cinema. Within martial arts cinema, there are roughly two genera, Wu Xia Pian and Kung Fu films. In the first, we delve into an idealized past where multiple heroic knights and martial clans clash in what is called the world of martial arts, the Jiangwu. The Kung Fu films put more emphasis on the reality of combat and the hardness of training to achieve a degree of martial mastery. If martial arts cinema seems to be a given today, there was a time when the genre was the subject of multiple political and social debates and was even banned in China. In this video, we will see the history of martial arts cinema on the mainland, from the height of its popularity to its death until its final resurrection. The heyday of Wu Xia Pian took place during the 1920s and 1930s in what was then considered both the Asian Paris and Hollywood, Shanghai. The question of which film was exactly the first Wu Xia Pian is still under discussion nowadays. Some say it was the first ever costume film made, Dingjun Mountain, produced in 1905. It is an opera film consisting of 3 segments showing some martial arts moves and acrobatic figures. For others, it was Lady Knight Li Fei, released in 1925, in which the title character is played by Fen Hua, also an opera star. She plays a knight helping a couple of lovers to concretize their love, despite the machinations of their respective families and their matchmaker. If, for the first steps of wuxia on the big screens, the filmmakers could base themselves on the impressive array of martial art literature past and present, it is worth noting that their main motivation were to counter the success of Hollywood productions like The Thief of Baghdad or Robin Hood, very popular titles with the local audience. They found in Wu Xia Pian a specifically Chinese equivalent, capable of competing with foreign adventure films and thus restoring the place of Chinese values in the face of growing Western influence, sometimes considered dangerous. Very quickly, success was achieved, and it was a tsunami of Wu Xia Pian that suddenly fell on China. Gradually, the martial art confrontations took more and more place within the films. In a parallel dynamic, the genre also began to incorporate more and more fantasy elements. The sudden popularity of Wu Xia Pian had an unexpected consequence. First praised for its promotion of strong Chinese heroes and traditional values, the genre quickly came under heavy criticism from intellectuals of all stripes. For them, these films were an apology of superstition and pornography. Their influence was such that the Kuomintang set up a censorship committee in 1931 with Wu Xia Pian as its main target. In 1935, as a result of this new policy, only a few Canton-based studios still managed to produce a handful of chivalrous films. When Japan invaded China in 1937, a part of Shanghai was declared neutral. It was in this particular context that Wu Xia Pian was able to develop again and experienced a second peak in popularity. The Japanese occupation of the city in 1941 put an end to this short but prosperous period for Wu Xia Pian. In 1949, the civil war between Kuomintang and communists ended. Mao and his people succeeded in seizing power. The communists wasted no time in implementing their program. Well organized thanks to their years of war, they implemented a series of economic and social reforms. At first cautious, the new power rapidly increased the intensity of its measures, determined to catch up with its Soviet big brother. Like the latter, great importance was given to cinema as a tool for education and propaganda. And for good reasons. The Chinese Communist Party had based its success on the support of the rural population. The peasant class was poorly educated and therefore more likely to be affected by cinematographic media rather than political literature. The authorities quickly made ways for their upcoming productions. All films prior to their coming to power were banned, as were films from the United States and Hong Kong. Like Soviet cinema before it, the People's Republic of China promoted so-called social realism. It was above all about sticking to reality while extolling the ideals of communism. A difficult exercise as the two did not necessarily go in the same direction. In this context, Wu Xia Pian had no place. Considered, again, as a nefarious genre influencing the public to remain subject to old superstitions, it was banned from the big screens of the country. However, the genre did not completely disappear from China during this period of frenzied Maoism. The Knights of Ancient Times retain a presence through other types of film. Thus, Havoc in Heaven, an animated adaptation of the Legend of the Monkey King directed by Wan Liming, on screen in local theaters in 1964, received a good reception from the public. But the Cultural Revolution once again sent the Chinese Knights back to the dustbin of history, at least for a decade. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, Deng Xiaoping implemented a policy of openness. No more Maoist austerity, China would slowly open up to the rest of the world and integrate a dose of capitalism into its system. Cinema logically followed the path dictated by the new secretary of the Communist Party. Starting from 1977, the studio timidly began to get rid of the restrictive criteria of revolutionary operas, and martial art films began to make their comeback on the screens of the country. Thus, in 1979, director Tang Xiaodan directed Aole Yilan. The film, set in 1643 near the Amur River, tells how a tribal chief manages to regroup different minorities in order to repel the Russian invader. While not strictly speaking a Wu Xia Pian, this ambitious costume blockbuster set the stage for the genre's imminent return to the PRC big screens. The same year, a cartoon called Nezha Conquers the Dragon King, and directed by Wan Shushen, dealt with the legend of the hero with a magic hoop. In this enterprise of rebuilding Chinese martial arts cinema, two major figures stand out: Zhang Huaxun and Cheng Xingyim. Graduated from the Beijing Film Institute in 1962, Zhang worked in the Chinese film industry as an assistant director for several years. When he was about to move on to directing, the Cultural Revolution broke out. Like many other members of the Chinese film industry, Zhang was deported to the countryside. The return to relative normality in the country and in the film industry after Mao's death allowed him to find his way back to the film studios. Finally moving on to directing in 1980, he made Mysterious Buddha, an adventure film featuring a bit of kung fu, and Pride's Deadly Fury, a pure martial arts film. Thanks to the success of these films, Kung Fu was once again becoming a popular subject in China. Logically, Zhang began the second part of his ambitions, to resurrect the Wu Xia Pian. He worked for a time on an adaptation of the classic Chinese chivalrous literature, Water Margin, but ended up abandoning the project for other, easier-to-mount creations. It was Cheng Xingyim who continued the enterprise started by Zhang Huaxun. Cheng Xingyim built his career in Hong Kong's vibrant film industry. First an editor, he got his first directorial job in 1964. He quickly made a specialty of martial arts films. As such, his first claim to fame was the Jade Bow, an ambitious Wu Xia Pian. He remained loyal to his first studio, Great Wall, one of the last to represent left-wing leaning cinema company in the city. When the country finally opened up under Deng's leadership, Chung was determined to participate in the revival of the mainland film industry. Thus, in 1982, he made Shaolin Temple, a kung fu film intended to show a new face of China and to show off its talents. Like Pride's Deadly Fury, the film was a hit, but unlike the later, it transcended the country's borders. Martial art films were once again popular in the People's Republic. If it was kung fu that prevailed at first, Wu Xia Pian quickly took on its own. In 1984, The Meeting of Two Heroes hit the screens. Directed by Chen Huahai, the film is adapted from the novel Li Zicheng by Yao Chuilin about the Ming-era hero of the same name. In 1986, the story of the famous Genghis Khan was brought to the screen in an ambitious blockbuster directed by Jian Qiangxi. Things picked up speed in 1987 when 5 films belonging to the genre were produced. This new generation of Chinese Wu Xia Pian stood out from its Hong Kong and Taiwanese counterparts by systematically filming outdoors and by adopting rough aesthetic. The characters were suffering heroes, clinging to their chivalrous ideals despite living in an unfair world. In 1988, veteran Cheng Xing-yim was credited with the first major achievement of the post-cultural revolution, Chinese Wu Xia Pian. Yellow River Fighter saw the director collaborating once again with actor Yu Cheng-hui, the main bad guy of the Shaolin trilogy. The film tells the story of Ma, a brave swordsman who lived under the Warring States era. The knight didn't have it easy. Desperate for the tragic death of his daughter, he took refuge in alcohol and gradually lost his sight. His wanderings bring him to the Yellow River, where he gives himself the mission of bringing peace and justice around him. Really shot on the banks of the Yellow River, Cheng Xing-yim film subtly evokes the Cultural Revolution. Ma, the aging hero, is the survivor of such a destructive phase of history, and despite the many physical and psychological consequences he had suffered from, he continues to believe in his ideals of justice and progress. In this, he is the symbol of a section of the intellectual who survived the Cultural Revolution. The atmosphere of the film is therefore both cruel and optimistic, just like China in the 80s. Another film of importance in the affirmation of a Wu Xia Pian with a uniquely Chinese identity was Swordsman in Double Flag Town, directed by Ping in 1991. The film was the culmination of Sergio Leone's influence on Chinese Wu Xia Pian. The characters are constantly dirty and driven by primary feelings. The buildings are dilapidated and the environment harsh. Further reinforcing this impression, the dialogues are reduced to a minimum, privileging above all the visual to tell his story. The director plays on this aspect all the more as the story revolves around perception and appearance. A virtuous knight can hide a cunning manipulator. An innocent peasant can turn out to be a dangerous fighter. A particularly dark vision of Jiangwu. In 2000, an event shocked the Chinese film industry. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon by Ang Lee, a multinational production including the United States, met with worldwide success. The fact that a Wu Xia Pian, an inherently Chinese style of film, was thus appropriated by the United States and, to a lesser extent, Taiwan, was seen as an humiliation. Mainland China therefore decided to reclaim the Wu Xia Pian and make sure it delivered an appropriate message. The first step in this direction was the production of Hero by Zhang Yimou. The fifth-generation director put his undeniable talent at the service of this enterprise, putting on a breathtaking aesthetic spectacle to the glory of the ruling power. The second step was the establishment of a co-production agreement between China and Hong Kong. Thus, Hong Kong productions were able to enter the Chinese market without being blocked by quotas on condition of complying with local censorship rules and using a number of the country's talents. Action and historical costume film involving substantial budgets relocated to Beijing and Shanghai. Having to adapt to a market very different from that of Hong Kong or the rest of Southeast Asia, Hong Kong producers and filmmakers reoriented their films to satisfy the taste of mainland Chinese audience and the government. The result is hybrid films, with a partially Hong Kong, partially mainland personality. The first film dedicated to Wing Chun master Ip Man is an emblematic example. The first half of the film follows Hong Kong tradition in Kung Fu films, reminiscent of earlier Kung Fu comedies like Lo Kar Leung's Martial Club. But the second is part of a more mainland tradition of both victimization and heroic resistance during the Second World War. Even the photography fits the standards used in China to describe the period. With the passage of time, this hybridization tends to favor more and more clearly the continental themes, as attested by the fourth episode of the series, promoting a union of all Chinese as an ethnic group and nationality against a racist and hypocritical America, or the recent filmography of Drélium promoting the PLA. Like in the United States, it is the local and foreign blockbusters which occupy mainly the screens of China. But there's also an entire ecosystem of mid to low budget exploitation movies that is thriving thanks to the recent development of local streaming platforms. Tencent, Youku, or even iQIYI now produces films in mass to attract and retain customers. And action, Kung Fu and Wuxia are the favorite genre of these DTV productions. This is where Chinese exploitation lies, in a movement not unlike what was happening in Hong Kong during its cinematic heydays. When Wilson Yip and Raymond Wong's Ip Man series hit the big screens, we see appearing in video Ip Man and the Four Kings, Young Ip Man Crisis Time, and Ip Man Kung Fu Master, the later with Denis To in the title role, he who already had played the Master of Wing Chun for Ip Man: A Legend is Born. When Disney's Mulan is about to come out, or even after, we see Matchless Mulan, Mulan the Heroine, or Mulan Legend. In this microcosm, a name that one might have thought to have been out of date continues to expand its influence. That name is Choya. In the 1980s and 1990s, the filmmaker had been a real powerhouse in the Hong Kong film industry. It was him who initiated many trends, from the Chinese ghost stories copies to the neo Wu Xia Pian wave. The inspirational power of his creations weighed astonishingly on the continent public and industry. This is obviously the case with his Detective D series, which marked his first commercial success specifically built for the mainland, and his more general reorientation towards China. Since then, more than a dozen Detective D have appeared on Chinese platforms. All adopt the structure of the first film, with a mystery tinged with fantasy that the famous detective will elucidate via more or less scientific explanations, all intersped with various adventures and fights. To make sure everyone is happy, we have an Andy Lau clone, Mark Du, who plays the character in some of them, but also a young Detective D, modeled on Mark Chao, generally played by Aiming Han. But this influence goes beyond the scope of his recent films. Thus, although Choi-Ark produced his last film dedicated to Wong Fei-hung in 1997, we see works appear that are directly part of his heritage, incorporating all the iconic elements of the character and his entourage, if not directly one of its main actors, the former wushu expert Vincent Zhao. Even A Chinese Ghost Story got its Chinese DTV remake with The Enchanting Phantom. While productivity is definitely there, with hundreds of titles now produced each year, what about quality? Although it is a little bit unfair to make such a generalization given the number of films produced, it cannot be said that the result is very brilliant. The action is often poorly staged and awkwardly choreographed. The plots are generally simplistic and repetitive. The themes very basic, playing on the lowest common denominator. But things are gradually improving. Special effects and production value have been gaining in quality. Some action sequences are now solid, if not more. And there are some nice touch of originality from movie to movie that makes watching them at least interesting. The Enchanting Phantom, for example, a new adaptation of Pu Songling, clearly inspired by Ching Siu Tung's The Chinese Ghost Story, without being at the level of its model, is a film that holds up and managed to bring enough specific elements to have its own personality. In 2022, we can say that the attempt to reappropriate the genre of Wu Xia Pian and Kung Fu by mainland China is now complete. Hong Kong can no longer commit sufficient funds to make this type of film in solo, and being de facto mainlandized by the effect of the national security law, no alternative can come from that side. Taiwan is a negligible voice, barely capable of producing an occasional Wu Xia Pian for a niche audience. China occupies the ground unchallenged, and the small world of exploitation plays a part in this dynamic. Still, this direct-to-video microcosm synthesizes the worst that Chinese cinema can do. Between the omnipresence of ultra-artificial digital special effects, frenzied nationalism, and generic stories, it is both the realm of opportunistic producers seeking to make easy money and the expression of the fantasies of part of the Chinese population towards its past and its present, more or less engineered by the government. But in this apocalyptic cinematic landscape, some quality works manage to emerge. They are difficult to identify because of the avalanche of titles produced each year. The DTV world is also a good way to develop the skills of actors and technicians who can then potentially work on larger productions once gathered enough experience. This dynamism, if combined with increased creative freedom, could in the long run allow the Chinese film industry from low to high budget to establish itself as one of the most interesting in the world.